Hello, this is Greg Deckler, and welcome to my session, DAX Counterculture for the Enterprise DNA Business Intelligence Summit. So to get started, I'm going to introduce myself. For those of you that don't know me, I'm Vice President at Fusion Alliance. I actually run the cloud practice. It includes the Microsoft technologies, Azure, Microsoft 365, Dynamics 365. Been doing basically consulting for about 28 years now. I've been MVP for about 7 years, I believe. Very active in the Power BI community forums, community.powerbi.com. Written a few books. Used to speak a lot more before COVID hit. Hopefully we'll get back into some of that stuff. And I'm also the author of the Enterprise DNA Power Tools, Quick Measures Pro, Power Sort, Conductor, Metadata Mechanic, DAX Editor. So that's a little bit about me. My session today is on, again, I called it DAX Counterculture. And the reason I came up with that name is that I think that any technology kind of over time develops a certain, I don't know, conventional wisdom or a culture around the technology. And I think that's certainly true in Power BI and even specifically with DAX, where, the community kind of promotes a certain way of doing things, a certain best practices, if you will. But for those of you the people that know me personally, they would never probably describe me as somebody that just kind of goes along with the crowd. I tend to be very much, I don't really trust, if somebody tells me, if it's in a position of authority and tells me something, I don't take things at face value, especially when I'm learning a new technology and that I really dig into it and kind of take my own approach to it. And that sometimes leads to different opinions than maybe the norm, if you will. So this is really going to be a session about, hey, here's the norms, but here's my perspective on those norms, and see where they match up and where they don't match up, and we'll take it from there. Maybe I should have called this, Greg's Rants Greatest Hits, I suppose, but we're going to cover things like the culture around calculate within DAX and time intelligence functions and looping indexes, the vitriol over the earlier function, which I find misplaced. And then talk about calculated columns versus measures in that. So let's just jump right into this. And the big topic really is calculate, right? I mean, calculate, the conventional wisdom out there is that it's kind of this, super powerful, all-purpose function. It's very performant, it performs really well. And really you should be, thinking in terms of calculate when you're creating your DAX, measures and that sort of thing. And so, I've written a blog article on this called Calculate, which kind of explains my perspective on why I don't think that's a good culture or that's a very good way to approach DAX. And the reason is, especially when you're starting out, calculate is one of the most complex functions within DAX. So the next slide will show you some of that complexity in that, but there's a lot of underlying assumptions about calculate in terms of what it assumes you have as a data model. It's very complex, it's very nuanced. There's a lot of quirks involved with it. And if you don't really understand what it's doing, you're going to get wrong values or how it's supposed to work. A lot of those underlying assumptions have to be true. Otherwise, it's just not going to work out for you. And I find it hard to debug using calculate. I think there's a much better patterns out there. And particularly, and you're going to see this throughout the presentation today, I'm going to be using a lot of the pattern that I use, that I came up with, in my kind of journey with DAX. And that is a pattern of, you create some variables, you create a table var, so a table variable that kind of filters down your rows to what you want it to be. And then you use an X aggregator, sum X, average X, max X, whatever it happens to be, across that table to, get your answer essentially. And I really, I go back to 6-7 years ago when I first got on the community forums and I was trying to learn, this Power BI thing and this DAX language, and I was very new to it. And a lot of the people that were responding with answers and that were all using calculate. So I'm like, oh, I should be using calculate to do all these things. And I really struggled with the DAX back then because I really didn't understand calculate at that time. I didn't really understand all of the complexity, all the nuances, all the underlying assumptions that Calculate had. And so I really struggled. But then when I hit upon, I just basically gave up. I'm like, look, I'm gonna try to think outside the box of Calculate and write some DAX, and come up with a pattern that works for me, and works every time, and it allows me to get to the right answer. And so I came up with this pattern, the table var X aggregator, and it really, really opened up the whole world of DAX for me. All of a sudden, I was able to solve incredibly complex DAX calculations just by using, this what I would call simple pattern, that I think is much more intuitive, much more logical, easier to debug, makes far fewer assumptions about your data model, and just a better way of doing things. So let me talk about a little bit. I'm not gonna read this entire slide, obviously, but this is off of the DAX.guide, which the SQL BI folks keep up to date. Marco Russo and Alberto Ferrari, the Italians, if you will, and also off of just Microsoft standard documentation around Calculate. And so the point of this slide is that unless you have read all of this and and more importantly, understand what all of this is saying, you really shouldn't be using Calculate, in my opinion, because you don't understand what's really happening under the covers, and you're going to get inconsistent values because you don't really understand what's going on within the Calculate function itself. And again, there's a better way of doing things, in my opinion. I mentioned my Calculate article, and this was something that really kind of hit home for me. I was watching a Ben Ferry, the Power BI guy, video, and he was interviewing. I don't remember his name because I'm bad with names, but it was somebody that was working in the mining industry in Australia. Yeah, and he's talking about they're talking about it's Ben Ferry, right? They're talking about all kinds of stuff. And they got on the subject of DAX. And this individual just kind of out of the blue is like, I really struggled with DAX until I read this article, called Calculate, by Greg Declan. I'm like, that's me, and he was talking about like once he read that and started adopting that pattern, that he became much better at DAX and was able to really solve, important, problems and calculations within DAX. And this kind of really struck me, because quite frankly, I don't write my blog articles really to help people or anything. I write them purely for selfish reasons. I find a topic that interests me or something, something that I find interesting, and so I'll write something up about it. I try to make it humorous, global turtle carnage, and throw in mathematician jokes and all kinds of stuff like that because I think I'm funny, whether I am or not. But it really struck me again. That's like, well, maybe there's something to this. Maybe this culture of Calculate within the DAX community is really kind of damaging, for new people that are trying to learn the language. That they see this Calculate and everybody's saying calculate, 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 but it's you're taking. Let me explain it in a different way. You're really kind of raising the bar, right? You're raising the bar from, you have to get away from your Excel, and you can make cell references, right? So the barrier to entry is here, right? There's already a barrier to entry to learning DAX, coming from something like Excel. And then you say, well, now just to start off, you need to understand the super complex Calculate function. So now you've raised the bar, right? And, but for Calculate to work, now you need to understand star schemas. And so now you've raised the bar even more, where the barrier to entry is just too high for people. And I think it turns a lot of people off of DAX, because they try to do a simple calculation and they use Calculate and they get the wrong answer. I think it's damaging. I really do, in terms of, especially for people that are new to the DAX language. And so let me, and that's why I've been leaving this not in PowerPoint presentation mode, because it's a pain to switch back and forth. But let me bring up, and show an actual example. So here is my example of Calculate, and all I'm trying to do is do a running total by date and month. So what I have here is I have a table. Let's get to my table. It just has date and then a value, which is generated by Rand. And then, I've got my month and my month sort columns so that the sorting is all correct, and I can have some decent looking things in my x-axis. But I'm using the running total that comes the quick measure. So all I did was I just fired up, this, and I created this measure based upon the quick measure, right? So when you go to here and say quick measure, and you say choose a calculation, and you come down here to running total, right? And I filled in, my value from my table here, my date field here, and so just this is your standard quick measure from using. Zoom in on this here. This is your standard quick measure that's created by using a running total that comes with DAX, right? This is Microsoft's code, if you will, for DAX. You can see it's using calculate and it's summing your table value. Then it has their filter clause for your calculate all selected, and then is on or after, which I don't know why they chose to go that route, but they did. And then your max table dates and descending, and whether you're new to DAX, you understand any of this is probably going to be a stretch. But as you can see, this is not a running total. It's not even close, right? It's obviously not, because if it's a running total, then from January to December, you should be getting a line that steadily increases. So it's the wrong answer. And why is it wrong? Well, it's wrong because calculate, again, is making some underlying assumptions about your data model that in this case are not true. Where it's assuming a star schema where my date dimension is a completely separate table than my fact table, right? Was one of the reasons why it's wrong. But think about this from somebody that's coming at it from an Excel. They've got an Excel spreadsheet of data. That's they're an Excel jockey. And they're great at Excel, and they're trying to import that into Power BI, into a Power BI data model, and then do some simple calculations like a running total. And they get the, and because they're, they don't understand how calculate works, and they're not using a star schema, and for all these various reasons, and they get the wrong answer, right? So versus, my pattern, and that's shown here. So if I go to value RT, here's that pattern, right? I grab the max date that's currently in context. I then create a table bar where I filter my table for all dates that are less than that date. And then I use SumX across it to sum up the value for all of the rows in that table. And guess what? You get the right answers, right? You have a nice running total. It works. And I think it's a lot simpler and a lot easier to understand than something like this. And it works every time. It makes no underlying assumptions. This will work if you have a single table. It works if you have a star schema. It works if you have a snowflake schema. This approach and this pattern to writing DAX just works. So, one other thing I'll say, in terms of the performance, wow, that's going to be slow, Greg. I mean, you're using an X aggregation across tables, table scan, blah, blah, blah. Hey, well, yeah, so I did some performance analysis, right? On these two visuals, and I refreshed, and yeah, the first time, my calculation took 26, I think that's milliseconds, 25 milliseconds longer. Oh no, 25 milliseconds. But as you can see, is it 65 versus 97, 71 versus 119, 67. So actually, in the majority of cases, my measure actually outperformed the calculate measure. So again, taking what people say at face value, and I've never been that person, if you will. I'd rather look for myself, and again, I'm not, once you master DAX, and you understand on that previous slide everything that that is going on, and really understand how calculate works, that's great. You can use calculate in that, but I think we're doing a disservice to the community as a whole by promoting that that pattern, if you will. Feel free to disagree, but those are my feelings on it. So that's the first part of our counterculture is don't use calculate. Probably not going to hear that from too many people, other than myself maybe. I don't know who else in the community really shares that view. But again, I think there's better ways of doing it, and there's a better culture that we could promote as a community to get away from this calculate thing. And it would really lower the barrier to entry for a lot of newcomers to Power BI and DAX, which I think should be a goal. Okay, so let's go ahead and move on to the next topic, and that is time intelligence functions. So, and maybe, this maybe is one of the least controversial ones, I don't know. But the conventional wisdom is, right, these time intelligence functions are there. They make these time intelligence calculations easy. And my view is you should never, ever, ever use DAX time intelligence functions at all. They're terrible functions. They're very black box. They, again, make some of the same assumptions that Calculate makes. Some of them are stupidly complicated, where like parallel period, dates and period, date add. I actually wrote a blog article called "To Bleep with Time Intelligence," basically to hell with time intelligence, and it gives alternative DAX. Like, okay, this is what this, you know, it you can use this time intelligence function, but it's, you could also write that with this DAX, right? And what happened, what came out of that exercise is that the vast majority of these time intelligence functions are just simple filter functions, or they're a min and max function. You can replace them by using min or max or simple filter clause. And some of them, but you shouldn't be using my DAX for like my alternative DAX for like parallel period and dates and period and date add. But really, what the purpose of those was kind of like peel back the covers of this black box. And like, okay, there's all kinds of edge cases that occur within those functions where if you don't really understand how it's operating, you're going to get wrong answers about it because, you know, they work weird. Whether you want to, like, if you want month to date or year to date, let's say, well, do you want to include today's date or do you not want to include today's date? Well, you don't really get an option with these functions, right? In terms of tweaking them to work exactly how you want those calculations to work. So you're going to get wrong answers. So anyway, again, and they're also useless for week calculations, and they aren't even named correctly because it should be date intelligence, not time intelligence. We're not working with hours and minutes here, people. We're working with dates. Right. So again, so let's jump back to here, and I'll show you an example on this time intelligence where we're just trying to create a simple previous month, right? So I've got my month here in my table, and I'm summing up my values, and then all I want is a value for the previous month. So as you can see here, for February, the previous month's January, et cetera, down the line. That's all we're going for. Well, this previous month calculation over here is actually using the time intelligence functions. So let me find time intelligence, and we'll see the previous month. And so here's how you might construct using previous month. Again, I'm using calculate, summing my values, all selected, previous month, as my filter, and that should give me my previous month, except it doesn't. All it gets blanks, right? And again, it's broken for kind of the same reason why the previous one was broken. I don't have a separate date table, so it doesn't work right. Whereas if I'd taken the trouble to go create a date table and mark it as a date table, then this would work. But it doesn't in my case, because again, underlying assumptions. And so why are we promoting things that assume a certain data model? I think that's foolhardy. The other thing that's wrong with all the date intelligence functions pretty much is they assume a standard calendar, which is mind-boggling to me because Microsoft themselves runs a fiscal from June to July. So they know that, so for Microsoft calculations, if they're trying to do fiscal year calculations, all those time intelligence functions are useless even to Microsoft because they don't run a standard fiscal calendar, right? It's not a standard Gregorian calendar, January to December, where they're doing these calculations over. So again, let's take a look at like my approach. And I have various different versions of this. Obviously, if you have a date table like the enterprise DNA date table, you would do these calculations a little differently. And having a really good date table is really helpful in performing some of these kinds of calculations. Having like a sequential day number or sequential week number or sequential month year number, right, can be really, really helpful. But it's not impossible to get previous month and do these other calculations if you don't have a really good date table. In fact, this doesn't assume any kind of date table. It assumes it's using the dates right from the table that I have. So again, I create a var, I grab my date, and then I use EO month, which is one of my favorite. If you're dealing with any kind of date related type calculations, EO month's a great function, in my opinion. So I can get my end date for the previous month by just doing an EO month of the date minus 1, so minus 1 month. So it gives me the end of the month, 1 month ago. And that spans across years, all of that sort of fun stuff. I don't have to worry about, oh, I went from January to December of last year kind of thing. This takes care of it for me. Now to get my start date, I can just grab the year of that date, the month of that date, and use 1, right? I mean, every month starts on day 1. So, now I've got my start of my month, my end of my month, I create a table var. I filter it so that I have my dates that are greater than or equal to the start date, less than or equal to the end date. That includes all those dates in the previous month. I do a sum x across it, and voila, I have my answer, and it works versus not working, right? So, again, don't use time intelligence functions. They're awful. They're terrible functions. And in my opinion, Microsoft should they're always adding DAX functions, right? They should remove time intelligence functions. They're that useless. So never rely on time intelligence functions. Do it yourself, right? I wrote a blog article, Time Intelligence the Hard Way, that shows how to do that. That might be a quick measure. I can't remember, but it's out there. It shows this kind of a process. Again, I mentioned Bleep with time intelligence. That's out there as well. It shows, and then in some of my books like Power BI Cookbook and Mastering Power BI Second Edition, both second editions, it has all the time intelligence functions. I think actually one of them, actually, kind of basically, well, here's the time intelligence way of doing it. Here's the non-time intelligence way of doing it, and it covers, pretty much any time intelligence calculation that you'd ever want to do. So that you don't. Well, that's all I'm going to say about time intelligence. I'm going to move on before I launch into some kind of rant about them. But I really do think Microsoft should remove them because newcomers to DAX, are going to run across those functions and think they're useful and will be disappointed. All right, so let's go back to DAX looping. Okay. So DAX looping, conventional wisdom is that there is no looping in DAX. Yeah, there is. Absolutely, there is looping in DAX. You can do it. And I'm going to show you how to do it right now. So if you didn't think DAX, you could loop in DAX, you are completely incorrect, in my opinion. So let's see here. So let's go ahead. And so I'm just doing a simple calculation of days of supply. All right. So we're using that same table. And we're going to start off and say, well, those numbers in that represent, product going out the door, inventory going out the door. And so we want to calculate we have a certain inventory level, and we want to know how many days of supply we have. Okay, so that's the calculation we're trying to do. So this is the calculation. Again, it's using that exact same pattern that I've been talking about. Right, I create a couple variables. In this case, I've just hard-coded my inventory level to 2,000. Obviously that would be different if there's a real-world situation. Be grabbing that from an inventory table. But again, I create a date variable. So it's date, and I'm just using today. I create a table variable, and in my table variables, I'm grabbing all of the dates that are greater than or equal to today. So now, in order to implement the looping, I create another table variable where I add a column to my first table variable. And I'm creating a column called __ inventory. I'm taking my inventory variable, 2000, minus, and I'm using an X aggregation across the table that I've already filtered. And you'll see here that I'm using earlier, right? Which we'll get to earlier here in a little bit. But basically what this is saying is, and think, people think about they talk a lot about context, and I think about it more as row sets. Okay, so I have a set of rows. That's table. Okay, and now I'm introducing a filter clause, which is going to create a different set of rows. So if I want to get my date value from the previous set of rows here, I can use earlier, right? So what this is saying basically, in this new filtered set of rows, take the dates that are for that table, and they want to be less than or equal to earlier. So basically what this is saying is that, hey, if I'm 3 days out from today, then I'll have 3-4 rows in my table, right? If I'm six days out, I'll have 6-7 rows in my table, right? Depending on how you count today and all that sort of thing. So that's all this is saying. I'm sum xing across it. So basically I'm building up. So at 3 days, maybe I've gone, day one is 100, then 200, then 50. So now this is going to be subtracting 350 from it. Whereas 6 days out, it's 100, 250, 100, 100, 100. Now it's going to be 650 that it's subtracting. So that's all. And so what happens then is that this new column kind of counts down, okay, as it goes forward. And so all I have to do then is, so this is the while loop, right? While loop, and then this is how I figure out where I need to exit my while loop. Exit, right? Because all I have to do is say, well, eventually this number is going to go negative, and that's when I'm out of inventory. Okay, so all I have to do is say filter that table that I've created, table 1, where that underscore inventory column is greater than or equal to 0, because, and I get the max value of that date. So that's the day, that's the last day that I have inventory for. Any date past that, this value goes negative, and I don't have supply for that date. So all I have to do then is subtract, my end date from my date. I do the times 1 to make sure it comes back as an integer, and I've got 41 days of supply. So there you go. There is looping in DAX right here. It's a while loop, right? So yes, so can you do, the DAX doesn't have looping? Well, not looping like, a for, there's no for function or while function, but can you do looping in DAX? Absolutely, you can do looping in DAX, and there's your proof of it. And I've used this looping to solve some really nasty problems, like trim mean comes to mind. It was actually a double concurrent while loop that was implemented in this same fashion. But yeah, that one's out there in the quick measure gallery as well if you want to review the code for that one. But that was a little bit of a nasty one that was previously not solvable. But once you can understand how to do loops in DAX, you can solve some really cool problems, especially around operations. I found, and you can implement things like FIFO and LIFO and all of those kind of fun stuff that you get into with supply chain type of situations. Okay, so that is DAX looping. Now, on a kind of similar note to some degree, you'll hear a lot of people say, well, you can't create an index in DAX. DAX doesn't, there's no way to do it. Well, sure there is, as it turns out. I mean, should you be doing it? Probably not. I mean, in the vast majority of cases, you should be using Power Query to add your index. But what if in the case of where you're using a DAX calculated table and you want to add an index to it? You don't really have that option. So let me show you about indexes in DAX. All right, so DAX index. All right, so what I'm using a source table. This is just a very simple example. It actually comes from the DAX query or the DAX quick measure I created called the mythical DAX index. And so here you see the base table. I've got orange, banana, apple, grapes, etc., different fruits, if you will. And obviously they're not in the alphabetical order would be apple, banana, and that sort of thing. But if you were to create a kind of equivalent index to this, right? Orange should be 1, bananas 2, apple 3, grapes 4, etc., etc. So here's the DAX for a DAX index. And as you can see, I've got orange of 1, banana 2, apple 3, grapes 4, kiwi 5, mango 6, coconut 7, the exact order that they appear in the data model. So let's take a look at the code. And it's going to follow that exact same pattern I've been talking about. So I grab my table, my DAX index source table, right, that I had created, just enter data query. And I count up how many of those rows I have, right? And then I use concatenate X. And concatenate X is a pretty, everyone will always tell you, well, DAX can't guarantee sort order, blah, blah, blah. And all. That's not true. DAX can absolutely guarantee sort order because concatenate X includes an order by clause where you can guarantee the sort order that's coming back from concatenate X. And this is really powerful when you use a pipe character, as I'm using here, in order to concatenate those values together. Because once you do that, you can use path item to grab them out in the order in which they are in the concatenated string. So all I'm doing is concatenating my product from my source table, pipe, using the pipe character, but I'm not specifying a sort order in this case. So when you do that, it just uses the order in the data set. Okay, so I get back orange, banana. Basically what you're going to get back from concatenate X is orange, pipe, banana, pipe, apple, pipe, grapes, pipe, kiwi, pipe, mango, pipe, coconut. All right, so once you have that, now I create my table variable. I use an add columns, and I use generate series. So I'm going from 1 into my count of the number of items that are from my source table, and then I'm adding a column where's product, and then path item, using path item to grab the row that corresponds to where I am in my generate series. That's the value column that you see in the path item function. That value is referring to the column generated by generate series, which is going to be 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, right? And so what it's saying is, for when I have an index of 1, go grab the first value in my concatenate X, which is orange. Now next, it's 2, grab banana, because that's the next, path item in my concatenate X. This is a very powerful technique. I use this technique for this basic technique and things like text to table and things, and a bunch of other kind of really cool calculations. It just happens to come in handy, really handy for this, creating a DAX index. Now, the last thing, I could have just returned my underscore table. I was using select columns here at the bottom in the return statement, just so that this actually said index versus value, which is the kind of the default column name that generate series is going to create. But here's the really cool thing about this, is that right here, that's a for loop. So you can do DAX while loops, and you can do DAX for loops. So what this is really saying is, for I equals 1 to the number of rows in my table, do this, right? It's a for loop. There's no mistaking it. So again, kind of call back to the looping in that. You can do DAX while loops, you can do DAX for loops. MA tells you can't do looping in DAX is full of it, because you can. And there's the proof right there. All right, so let's keep going. Okay, earlier is like the pariah. There's so much vitriol about earlier out there, and I'm not joking. I mean, people hate that function. Here, just to give you a anecdotal story. So I wrote a book called DAX Cookbook, and it's got over 70 different DAX calculations. And if you really want a tour de force in this technique that I've been talking about, where create some variables, create your table variable, X aggregator across it, that book is full of it, because all of those, pretty much every one of those calculations that are in there follows that pattern. But it's an individual that reviewed the book, and because I'd used earlier in like 1 or 2 of those recipes, they gave me a 1-star review for it. So that's how badly people despise this earlier function. And I just think it's uncalled for, and I can't wrap my head around it to a large degree. It even shows up in places, and not to pick on the Italians, but they have their DAX guide that's out there, and there's only I think there's only 2 functions that have this this big red not recommended flag on them. It's earlier and earliest, which are basically the same kind of function. But it's and so that it's at this this is why it's so uncalled for, because in my opinion, every time intelligence function out there should have this huge not recommended flag on it. I don't know why they don't. Those are terrible functions. I mean, in comparison, earlier is a fantastic function compared to all of the time intelligence functions. I mean, they're just absolutely useless and terrible functions. I really can't express how much I despise those functions, and just how much damage I think they do. But in comparison, earlier is just fine. So now, is it true though that earlier, is from a bygone era? I guess you could say that. Earlier was there before variables. So DAX, just FYI, if you don't know, there was a time when DAX didn't support variables. That it wasn't a concept in DAX. But let's take a look at, we've already reviewed my days of supply, right, where I use earlier. It's right there, inventory, and sum X and all that. The equivalent to doing that would be to not use earlier and use a variable. So as you can see in my add column statement for table 1, it's the same basic calculation, only this time I'm using a variable, current date equals date. So I grab that, and that's in place of using earlier. So now I can just say inventory minus the sum X of the date less than or equal to current date value, right? But to be honest, earlier is just a nice shorthand, and it makes the DAX, I think, a little cleaner to read. I mean, anytime you start getting into nested var return statements, it's not the easiest code to decipher and read, in my opinion. It starts getting rather complicated, especially if you're new to DAX. You start seeing nested var return stuff, and you're like, what's going on? But yeah, so yeah, earlier you don't need it. You can make your life more complicated and not use it and use nested vars and returns if you want. That's fine. I just think it's just overblown for me for earlier in terms of why so many people despise that function. It's just a handy, nice little function when you need it. Like anything else, if you understand how to use it, I think it's perfectly fine. I don't think there's a problem with it whatsoever. Okay, so moving on. We're going to talk about calculated columns versus measures. So now, again, the conventional wisdom here is that you should never use calculated columns. You should always use measures for everything. And the reason is because it's going to slow down your data load. It's going to cause your data model to be bloated. All of these reasons, which are perfectly valid reasons. But there's one scenario, in my opinion, where measures fall down. They fall flat on their face. And that is in a self-service BI situation where you're creating a data model with all of your columns and the measures and all of that, and you're going to turn that loose on an unsuspecting public, right? Hey, here's this data. Go create, hey, business users, go and create this to do your own self-service analysis. And whether that's a good idea or not, that's kind of one of the purposes Power BI was sort of purpose built for. So the reason why measures fall flat in that case is because of Microsoft's never bothered in forever since Power BI was created. They've never bothered to fix their broken, and I'm saying they're broken, table and matrix visualizations, where the total row, it just doesn't match, right? It doesn't match what a normal human would expect, right? In terms of DAX, yeah, we all understand what it's doing. The DAX is calculating in the context of all, and that's why the totals never match up or don't match up typically when you're using any kind of simple or even complex and even simple measures. So until Microsoft fixes, which I don't know if they'll ever will, their table and matrix visualization so that the totals come out in what normal humans would expect. Until they fix it, I think calculated columns are far superior to measures in a self-service scenario. And let me go ahead and show this to you again in terms of columns and measures, right? So and you can't get much of more of a simple measure than what I've created. So here's the measure I created. It's the sum of the value minus 200. That's it. Can't get much more simple than that. So if you have anything even more complex than this, you're probably going to have an incorrect measure total, right? So what's going on here is that, this is going to sum up all of the values in the table and then subtract 200 versus subtracting 200 at each point and then summing that all together. So what's going on here? So this is using a column, and I'll show you the column formula here in a minute. But this is 2,200 off because 200 times 12 is 2,400 minus 200 is 2,200. So this number is 2,200 off. And it scares the bejesus out of me, to be honest, about how many incorrect measure totals are out there in the wild, because people just don't know or don't realize. And how many incorrect business decisions are being made because this thing is wrong. It scares me. It doesn't keep me up at night, but I think about it from time to time and just like, ugh. So anyway, so to fix it, so to fix it, right, you can use a calculated column. Let's get back to my. So here, again, create a couple variables, create a table variable, use max XX across that table variable, and then I can use some X across that table variable. Anyway, what this is essentially doing is saying, okay, at the last day of every month, give me the total for that month. Otherwise, return minus the 200. Otherwise, return blank. And this is a crap example, but essentially, if you have a column, right, then you don't have to worry about how they use it in a table or a matrix, right? And now you can solve the measure total problem, right? So here I've created another measure total problem, or measure total. And lo and behold, how do you solve the measure total problem? Well, you create a table var, and then you use a sum x aggregation across the table var. It's the same pattern. Again, you can use this pattern to solve any problem in DAX. So what this is saying, is in scope, table month. So if month is in scope, then just return the measure. Otherwise, create a table var which uses summarize it by month, create a value column that uses that same measure, and then at the end, you just sum X across that table, and you get the right answer, right? But here's the problem with self-service. You have no idea what they're going to aggregate by. It could be month, it could be week, it could be year, it could be quarter. Maybe they're going to create an ad hoc hierarchy of year, quarter, month. Maybe they're going to pull in like a color dimension from their products table, and they're going to include that in their matrix or their table. Like, you can't anticipate in a self-service BI situation, what the user is going to do, and therefore you can't create a measure that's going to work in all circumstances for getting the total correct. So what are you left with at that point, right? Well, business users, you can use this data, but turn off totals in table and matrix visualizations and don't create hierarchies and matrices. And I mean, it's ridiculous. So again, if you can, in a self-service BI scenario, if you can create columns that and use those columns instead of measures, and I've done this with a number of companies that have wanted to do self-service business analytics. Once you get on that path, calculated columns are far superior than measures, because you're going to get wrong answers with measures. There's just no two ways about it. Okay, so that's kind of the end of this DAX counterculture presentation. But before you go, if there's just one thing that you can take out of this session, just one thing, and if I can summarize it all in just one point being made, take this away from this session, right? I'm right and everyone else is wrong. So that's it. hope everybody has a great business intelligence summit, and I'll talk to you guys all some other time.